Okay, so after the election of 1856, for abolitionists, for Frederick Douglass, for the enslaved, for northern whites who don't really care about African Americans in states where slavery exists, but who don't want slavery to expand into new territories, things look really bleak. It's going off. It's going really poorly, and the South wins most of the battles in the 1850s, except for, I guess, California coming into the Union as a free state. But the South has real momentum in the 1850s. And one of the key moments in our story is the Dred Scott decision of March of 1857, soon after James Buchanan of Pennsylvania became president of the United States. And again, Buchanan's a Northern Democrat who works with Southerners in the Democratic Party alliance, and he's very pro-slavery. He doesn't own slaves himself, but he's definitely willing to work with those in the South that want slavery to expand. In fact, Buchanan wants to purchase Cuba. The Democrats in the 1850s demand that the U.S. purchase Cuba because, of course, Cuba was also a slave society, and slaves were still coming into Cuba in the 1850s. If you take in Dr. Felipe Gonzalez, he talks about this. So Southerners are not only do Southerners want to expand within the boundaries of what's now the United States, especially the lower 48 states. Southerners also want to purchase Cuba, and they're quite open about this. And this goes back to this whole slave power conspiracy, this belief that there's this cabal that's intent on expanding slavery all throughout the lower 48. Well, it wasn't 48 at that point, but the territory that would become the lower 48 U.S. states, but also into places like Cuba as well. So March 1857, the Dred Scott decision is announced by the Supreme Court. And I've got a picture of Dred Scott up on my computer screen, very dignified man. And, I've always, thought his name was so interesting, Dread. It's like the dread of the oncoming Civil War. The question is who should be dreading the war, the North or the South? Well, initially, it's looking bad for free state advocates. So real quick, what's the Dred Scott decision? Dred Scott had been owned by a physician who was in the U.S. Army. Okay, so Dred Scott was a slave who was owned by a physician who was in the U.S. Army. And because this man, and I can't remember his name now, the Dred Scott's owner, because he was in the Army, he traveled all over the United States, places where there were states, but also places where it was just territory. And Scott gets married to his wife, and his wife's name is Harriet. Scott is 40 and Harriet is 17. They get married when Scott lives in Fort Snelling, which is now the state of Minnesota. So in other words, Dred Scott was taken to territory that was free soil territory. There was because of course, they got married before the repeal of the Missouri Compromise line, right? So Scott goes into territory that everyone agrees is free territory, at least at the moment he got married, and he marries this woman named Harriet. And by the way, we've learned a lot about Scott in the last 20 years, and he was actually quite a talented physician's assistant or nurse for the doctor that owned him. So he wasn't just someone that was just hanging around. He was actually a very, very prized medical practitioner. Not a doctor himself, but very important to the doctor that owned him and when the doctor was treating these patients. Okay, so when Scott he's taken to Minnesota territory, he gets married in Minnesota territory, and then he and Harriet have two children. And what we think happened is that Harriet, the much younger wife of Dred Scott, she pushed him to sue his owner for their freedom, because of course Harriet, like Harriet Jacobs, is very, very concerned that her children are going to be taken away from them. So when the suit happens, when the Dred Scott suit happens, they live in St. Louis, which is in Missouri, which of course is a slave state. The physician that had owned Scott had died, and Scott moves into the ownership of the physician's family. It's very complicated, and I'm not going to go into it. So, oh, by the way, I just found the doctor's name, John Emerson. So Dr. Emerson had died in 1842. Scott has a couple of children, and Harriet pushes Scott to sue in federal court, claiming that Scott was free because he had moved into free territory. And of course, if Scott's free, that means Harriet's free, which means that their children are free, and that they're citizens, and that they can't be sold out and separated from Dred and Harriet. So it's a very long court case. It starts in 1846. It has a number of twists and turns, but ultimately it gets to the Supreme Court in 1854. This thing took forever to get to the Supreme Court. And while it is still winding its way through the courts, Dred Scott, Harriet, the children remain in St. Louis. So finally now the Supreme Court gets the Dred Scott case. And again, to repeat, what Scott is claiming, what his allies are claiming, is that because he had moved, he had been taken into the Minnesota territory, which was free territory, which is where he'd gotten married to Harriet. They'd had children, that they were all free. So it goes to the Supreme Court. Now, remember, as I said a couple of times, 2/3 of the members of the Supreme Court between the 1790s and 1860 were slave owners, not just justices or people that were supportive of slavery. They actually owned slaves. And why is that? Because, of course, the slaveholding class controlled the presidency, and who appoints the Supreme Court justices? It's the president. So the Dred Scott decision goes before a very, very unfriendly judicial body. More than that, Buchanan, there's a lot of behind-the-scenes communication going on between Buchanan and the members of the Supreme Court, a guy by the name of Roger Taney. Now, Taney's name is spelled Taney. It sounds like Taney, but it sounds like Taney. It's spelled like T-A-N. It's spelled T-A-N-E-Y. You would think it would be called Taney. It's Taney. Now, how much more detail can I get? Quick story. I was at Princeton one semester, and I got to work with this guy named James McPherson, who won the Pulitzer Prize. Great historian, really nice guy. And for the first couple of times, I was talking about Taney, and I was saying Taney, and he finally said, "Pat, it's Taney." Very embarrassing moment in my career. One of many embarrassing moments in my career. So anyway, to go back to Dred Scott, the fix is in. Buchanan's working with this pro-slavery Supreme Court. And what they decide is they want to have a decision that settles the question of slave citizenship, that settles the question of whether or not slaves could move into territory, the new territory that the United States had either purchased or taken from Mexico. So here's the big point about the Dred Scott decision. It's a Hail Mary pass on the part of the Supreme Court in collusion with James Buchanan, the President of the United States. They're working hand in glove here to finally settle once and for all the territorial question. Could slavery expand in the United States, not only into the new territory that was being carved out of the Mexican Cession and the Louisiana Purchase, but just generally? So that's the significance of the Dred Scott decision. What the Supreme Court, it's an attempt on the part of a pro-slavery president and a pro-slavery Supreme Court to settle the question about the expansion of slavery once and for all. And I'll stop here and I'll talk about the decision in just a second.